joining in right now. As we do the session, if you have any questions, just pop them into the chat, and at the end, when we ask more questions, we can just bring them up. And if they haven't been answered throughout the session, then we'll make sure we bring it up so you guys can get some answers.
Okay, so let's see. So we can just start it up now, I guess. Perfect. Are you guys good to go? That's great.
Yep.
Awesome. Great. So Mark, you want to start it off?
Yeah. So yeah, welcome everyone. I just wanted to welcome you to our second session with our special guest, Dr. Scott Forbes, today joining us on our topic on creatine. And he is a well-known researcher in this field. So we're really lucky to have him here today and just give us all this insights. So next slide. Today's session, we'll start with several questions that you guys have asked us to include, and also some of the questions that we have collected on our own. And we'll be asking that to Dr. Forbes. And at the end, we'll also ask any other questions that you guys have from the group. So we'll have a little time at the end for that as well.
Yeah, so just before we get into just this session here, I just want to give a special thanks and shout out to Dr. Little just for coming out last session. And for those of you who came out to our last session, you obviously saw that he was an amazing guest, and he brought forth a lot of great information and helped us a lot. So just wanted to give a huge thank you to him. And he also connected us to Dr. Scott Forbes here today. So just want to give a huge thank you to him and everything he's done. So great. Okay, so yeah, also just want to give some shout outs to just a few clubs as well. First, just a Pharmaly mentorship program. For pharmacy students, it's a really great program, just puts you in touch with a lot of upper year students and gives you a lot of great resources as a pharmacy student. You can follow them at their Instagram handle right there at pharmaly.ioy or farm.ioy. And then the UBC Power Building is a really great club, just recently started here at UBC, and we're collaborating with them currently right now. They have a lot of really great opportunities. And specifically, they've been working to sell supplements at cost. They've had a lot of number of sponsors, especially with Supplement King. So if you're interested in getting cheap supplements as a UBC student, definitely check them out and follow them at their Instagram right here. So perfect.
Alrighty, so I will just go ahead and introduce our guest. We have Dr. Scott Forbes here. So Dr. Forbes is an associate professor at Brandon University's Faculty of Education. So he's certified as a clinical exercise physiologist, high performance specialist, and sports nutritionist. Dr. Forbes has been the lead researcher on numerous publications on creatine, but on many other topics as well. So I encourage you to check out his Brandon U profile to find all the research that he's been a part of. It's really quite impressive. So if you can't tell at this point, we have an outright expert in the field here. So he's quite literally as good as it's going to get on this topic. So yeah, Dr. Forbes, we're super grateful for your time and welcome. And please let me know if I missed anything important in your bio.
No, that's pretty good. I also have, I'm a certified sport nutritionist through the ISSN as well, the International Society of Sport Nutrition. It's a little bit more recent, so maybe I haven't put it up on my Brandon U bio yet. So that's something that I should add, but I think that's also important to understand.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right, I guess I'll just start off with our first question here. It's just wondering what got you interested in your field of study, just as far as your background and generally what got you into it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was always interested in sport. So I used to be a paddler. So I used to canoe, similar to like Mark Oldershaw. You might have heard that name before. He was an Olympic medalist, or Adam Van Koeverden. He was a sprint kayaker in the same kind of discipline that I was. So I did that fairly competitively, and then I actually got into this obscure sport called canoe polo. So it's actually played in kayaks, but they call it canoe polo. And it's essentially water polo, but played in kayak, played in kayak. So you throw the ball into the opponent's net and try to keep it out of your own net. But the net's actually suspended 2 meters in the air. So I was just always involved with sport and really interested in sport. And part of enhancing sport is understanding sport nutrition. And so I actually did my master's degree at the University of Saskatchewan alongside Dr. John Little. And we studied exercise metabolism. And then I went on and did my PhD at the University of Alberta and studied sport nutrition. And then I actually did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Calgary, where I kind of got away from sport nutrition a little bit, but I looked at nutrition and exercise interventions to enhance cognition or brain health, which I think has kind of influenced some of my recent research, because some of the benefits of creatine is also not only on muscle performance but also on brain health as well. So I think why did I get interested in the field of study that I kind of do now? It's just out of general interest. I wanted to enhance my own performance, but I would say over the last 10 years or so, my focus has been on creatine, and mainly because it's one of the few supplements that actually works. So we find, significant benefits when we run our research studies. So we get really excited when we find those benefits, and then we want to answer some more questions. Can it work in different populations? Can it, enhance different tissues within the body and things like that? So I think that's what really keeps me kind of motivated and excited, is just that it's one of those few supplements that, seems to work over time.
Perfect. That's awesome. Yeah, I think some of the questions that we're going to be asking throughout the session kind of are directed to some of those things that sounds like got you into the interested in the research. That's really good. I guess I'll pass it off. Is it Vinay next or Mark next?
I'm up next. Yeah.
Mark, okay,
So right into our topic. So could you please summarize what creatine is and what it generally does in our body when we take it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So creatine is actually derived of 3 amino acids: arginine, glycine, and methionine. And our body can synthesize it. So within our liver and our kidney primarily, we can synthesize creatine. And then about 95% of the creatine that we get into our body is taken up by the muscle. We can also get creatine in our diet as well. So things like seafood, like salmon or herring, for example, have high concentrations of creatine, but you can also get it in red meat or chicken or other pretty good sources of creatine as well. So you can get it from your food, or you can obviously get it as a supplement. You can go to Supplement King, I heard. So that's one place that you can go to get creatine as a dietary supplement. So once you ingest it or produce it within your body, as I mentioned, about 95% of it's taken up into your muscle. And once it's in the muscle, about 2/3 of it is converted into phosphocreatine. So phosphocreatine can be broken down. So you add phosphocreatine with adenosine diphosphate, and you have one enzyme, creatine kinase, which creates ATP. So ATP is like the energy currency within cells. And so anytime you do anything that requires energy, it uses up ATP. So you can replace it with this particular energy system. But creatine does a lot more in the body than what people think. It also actually brings in more glycogen into the muscle cell as well. So if you take creatine with carbohydrates, you can actually get more glycogen into the muscle. So glycogen is another fuel source for the muscle, and could be a benefit, particularly during high intensity exercise. And then creatine also brings water into the muscle cell as well, and that causes a whole cascade of events that occurs within the muscle that can lead to muscle growth over time as well. And I've been talking about the muscle quite a bit, but there's creatine found in other tissues as well. We actually have creatine in our brain, as I've kind of alluded to previously. And we know that actually if you supplement with creatine, there's evidence that you can actually increase the amount of creatine within your brain. It's not quite as robust as what happens at the muscle level, but there is evidence to support that. So creatine can have an impact on a variety of different tissues, mainly by providing more energy to the cell, but it works through other mechanisms as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really interesting to understand that. Like, I think people just think it's mainly a muscle building supplement, but there's evidence, like you said, to support that there's other effects to do with creatine. And it has a lot of implications just for going forward, just even past the supplement industry. So definitely.
Yeah,
Perfect.
so our second question, we just wanted to quickly ask, who would benefit the most or least from creatine supplementation? Because we know that there are various different types of athletes out there. Some of them who do endurance work like marathon runners versus someone who does like very like short burst of movements like power lifters. So is there any like differentiation in terms of that? Like who would benefit better or worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of the research has been done on like people who perform resistance training or strength training. And that's where most of the benefit is with regards to creatine supplementation, because it creates ATP really rapidly. So those types of, really intense activities really benefit from this particular energy system. But as I mentioned, you could actually, if you take creatine with carbohydrates, you can actually get more glycogen in your muscle as well. So there's potentially some benefits to other endurance athletes as well. And there was actually a really interesting study where they did a 120-kilometer time trial, and these really well-trained cyclists, they're at the Australian Institute of Sport. It's like one of the top kind of sport institutes in the world. So they had these really good athletes. They made them do 120 kilometers of biking, which is crazy. I wouldn't want to do that, but these athletes did. And every 10 kilometers, they had to do either 1 kilometer as hard as they could, and then they'd go another 10 kilometers, and then they'd do 4 kilometers as hard as they can, and then go another 10 kilometers. So every 10 kilometers, they went back and forth between either a 1 kilometer sprint or a 4 kilometer sprint. And what they found was the athletes that took creatine, they actually performed better in the last 1 and 4 kilometer sprint in that 120 kilometer time trial. So there is some benefits for creatine supplementation to enhance endurance performance, but most of the evidence is looking at the effects of creatine to enhance strength. So putting on, more muscle, more power, and more strength in resistance training, power-based type athletes.
So just going off of what you mentioned, like if your muscle just all of a sudden starts absorbing more water, more glycogen, would that actually like result in like a significant size difference in beginners? Because like I think that's what causes like huge trend in like saying like creatine is pretty much like steroids. It'll make you look big really quickly. Like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so right off the start, you're going to gain some water weight. And it could be about 1 to 2% of your body weight. So you could put on a decent amount of weight when you start taking creatine. I think that's maybe why people think like it's a steroid or it's like doing some crazy things within your body. But it's mainly just, manipulating water content within your muscle cell. But I think important to that is actually that water retention actually stimulates the muscle to grow. So over time, it's actually a good thing, and you build more muscle tissue, and you can actually increase muscular strength and power and all those good things that happen over time from that particular mechanism. So it's actually it's not something to be afraid of, but there's definitely some individuals that don't want to put on any weight. They're like, I don't want to go to the gym and lose weight. And creatine's a tough supplement to sell to those individuals because they are going to put on about 1 to 2% of their body mass, mainly because of that water retention, then over time, building of muscle. So they are going to gain some weight when they take this particular supplement. But the interesting thing is that you need to convince them that their body composition is going to improve. So they're going to put on muscle. And we've actually shown, at least in older adults that perform resistance training, if you took creatine, you lost about 0.5 kilogram more fat mass compared to the group that just resistance trained. And so if you tell them, hey, you might gain a little weight, but you're going to gain muscle and you're going to lose fat, they might come around to the idea after a little bit of convincing that, that's an improvement to your body composition. And that can happen with creatine supplementation.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really good point. I mean, because sometimes individuals often look at the scale as like just a black and white thing. So If the scale's going up, you're gaining fat. If it's going down, you're losing fat. So oftentimes it's tough to kind of disconnect that understanding with, as the scale goes up, you could actually be improving your overall body composition without that fat gain. So yeah, definitely. So I mean, the scale doesn't tell the full story, and of course it doesn't do creatine justice. So yeah, it's definitely a great point for that.
Yeah, and kind of going on that as well, there's a great study from McMaster University from Stu Phillips' lab, where they look at high protein diet versus a lower protein diet. And they reduce their caloric intake of these individuals by 40%. So they're eating 40% less calories.
Yeah.
Plus, they were relatively sedentary individuals, and they made them do 10,000 steps a day. Plus, they had to do like HIIT training, sprint interval training. They had to do resistance training. They also had to do a time trial once a week, like all this additional exercise. So of course, if you reduce their calories and increase their energy expenditure, they're going to lose weight. And what they found was actually both groups, the high protein group that consumed 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, they lost the same amount of weight as the lower protein group that was 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And so if you just looked at weight, you'd be like, okay, those diets are, the exact same. Both groups lost the exact same amount of weight. But when you look at body composition changes, what they actually found was the high protein group, they actually gained muscle even in that caloric deficit, which was pretty surprising. And the first time that I've ever seen that done, at least over the short term, if you do really intense exercise, it is possible to do that. And so they gained more muscle, and they also lost more fat mass. So their body composition changes were much better with the high protein group than the lower protein group, which was still higher than the RDA, which is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So yeah, that's just another study to show that disconnect between weight loss and body composition changes. So I think body composition is really important to look at, not necessarily weight.
Exactly. 100%. Yeah, it definitely doesn't do it justice, especially with that kind of research coming out. That's definitely changes everything. So, well, perfect. So yeah, so now this is the big one. This is the slide that, people have been waiting for. It's the meat of the presentation. So yeah. So I mean, I'm sure everyone has heard at some time or another around the fitness industry that creatine causes hair loss, because there was a study around 2.5 years ago with a group of 20 rugby players, and they found that it increased levels of DHT, which if anybody's not familiar, it's just a DHT is like essentially a specific type of testosterone, or a form of testosterone that's more potent. And DHT acts at your hair follicles and can often act to lose that hair. So individuals who do sometimes abuse steroids, they find that they lose hair because of this increase in acute DHT levels. So because this study found that there is an increase in DHT levels, they concluded that, creatine could be associated with hair loss. So specifically, I wanted to ask you first, Dr. Forbes, is this study relevant specifically to creatine? Is something we should consider? And does creatine really cause hair loss?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And obviously I have no hair, so take that with a grain of salt. But I heard that some of these hosts here were creatine consumers, and they have beautiful hair. So also take note of that. So that's some anecdotal evidence, but actually no study has ever looked at creatine and hair loss. So even that particular study showed a increased conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, as you mentioned. And DHT has been linked to male pattern baldness. But in that particular study, they actually never measured hair loss. And then I don't even know what the mechanism would be for creatine to actually cause an increase in that conversion of testosterone to DHT. So yeah, is it possible that creatine causes hair loss? Maybe, because no one's actually ever measured it before. But there's also no evidence to actually support that it does cause hair loss. So yeah, there's lots of people with beautiful hair that have taken creatine, And yeah, presently there is no study to ever look at creatine and hair loss.
Yeah.
I would also note that in that particular study, the changes in that particular hormone, DHT, were very small, and actually the placebo group went down and the creatine group, I believe, went up slightly. So at the end of the study, they said there was a difference between the two groups, but it was all within normal physiological ranges. And so again, like, yeah, if you ever try to measure hormones in the lab, like, there's a decent amount of variability, even when you try to control it the best you possibly can. And maybe like a 5 to 10%, change is not really a true change. So yeah, it's something to be really cautious about when you're trying to interpret those studies. And then again, yeah, they never even measured hair loss. So I would say currently there is no evidence that creatine causes hair loss.
Yeah, 100%. And then anecdotally as well, I know me, Si and Mark have been taking it for a long time, almost now going on almost 2 years straight or even longer. And we have not seen any effects of that so far. So take that as you will. It's something to consider. But yeah, thank you, Dr. Forbes, for that answer. It's a great way to put it. And then the next side questions here is that there's also been reports of individuals like mentioning issues with acute diarrhea, and also like, individuals will say, I don't want to take creatine for long periods of time because of kidney and liver stress. Is that something that should be considered with creatine? Is that something that actually happens, or yeah?
So yeah, I'll start with the acute diarrhea and GI distress. There is some scientific support for that, particularly during the loading phase. So there's like a strategy where you'll take 20 grams a day for 5 to 7 days. And that 20 grams is usually separated into 4 different doses. So you take 5 grams 4 times a day. And there is evidence that some people get GI distress when they take that high loading phase. But we also know that you can take a lower amount of creatine, just 3 grams a day, and you could actually get to the same percent increase within your muscle as when you do the loading phase and then drop to a maintenance dose. So for people that do have like sensitive stomachs and do have some negative side effects associated with that loading phase, I just suggest don't do the loading phase and just take a lower amount of creatine. It might take a little bit longer to saturate your muscles with creatine, but then you can avoid those negative side effects.
Exactly.
With regards to the kidney and liver stress, this is a big one actually, and people use creatinine. So creatine is non-enzymatically degraded into creatinine, and medical doctors use creatinine levels as an indicator of kidney stress or kidney function. And so if you take creatine, your creatinine levels will increase, but that actually doesn't indicate that you're doing any damage to your kidneys. And so that's an inappropriate kind of use of creatinine. I think of it as kind of like exercise, or sorry, like resting heart rate. If you don't take into account, so resting heart rate could be a good indicator of health. Like if you have low resting heart rate, that can mean you're like a really good trained athlete compared to somebody who has a higher resting heart rate. But if the doctor doesn't take into account if they just did exercise or not, then that could be a big flaw. So obviously exercise is going to elevate their heart rate, and just as taking creatine is going to elevate your creatinine levels. And so if you don't take that into account, you're coming up with a completely inappropriate conclusion that that creatine is actually doing some damage to your kidneys. I actually just published a review with I published it with a nephrologist, and again, we had these discussions quite a bit, and there's no evidence that creatine actually causes any kidney damage. There's a couple of published case studies, but they're really confounded by tons of other things that the individual is taking. So the person wasn't just taking creatine, they were taking like 20 other supplements at the same time. They might have been like on anabolic steroids. There was one a case report where the individual is consuming over 200 grams of creatine per day. So maybe at that dose, it's probably bad for your kidneys. It's bad for everything else at that dose. Yeah, there's just really outrageous kind of case studies out there, but
Yeah.
there's no evidence that, at least in the recommended doses in healthy individuals, that it does any damage.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree. I think that often with the public is too quick to see that, just to make those conclusions, because like you said, higher creatinine levels have been associated with that in the clinic, but then just because it's converted to more creatinine in your body doesn't necessarily mean that that's also indicative of you getting kidney issues down the road. So yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, especially with the resting heart rate. So if I just come in from a workout, somebody measured my heart rate and it's 140, that's not my resting heart rate. That's just because I went for a run. So no reason to be alarmed, right? So I definitely think that's a really good way to put it. So yeah, well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Forbes. That's a great way to put that. And I guess for this question, you've already somewhat answered it, but specifically, I know you mentioned with the loading phase and how people do 20 grams a day. And I originally did that for like 5 to 7 days. But then also I know that if you don't take a loading dose, it would take a bit longer for you to get that creatine saturation. But in the end, you know, you're going to be having the same effect. I guess specifically because you've mentioned that, I guess I could ask, is that 5 grams a day that's on the back of the bottle, is that standard across the board, like a one size fits all, or, you know, based on weight and level of training, can that 5-gram value be changed somewhat, or can it be less or more depending on those factors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, so I did mention that you don't have to do the loading phase. You can just take a lower dose. That's from a muscle perspective. So you're going to get the same amount of creatine within your muscle, about a 20% increase, whether you do a loading phase or you do a lower dose for a little bit longer period of time. So it might depend on your goals. Like if you want to get as much creatine into your muscle as quickly as possible, then you might want to consider a loading dose. But if you just want to take creatine for general health and you're not worried about, you know, what's going to happen in the next week or 2 weeks, you just, you know, looking over the next year, for example, then yeah, a low dose creatine is perfectly fine. The question you asked about, might there be conditions where you might need more creatine? The answer is we think there might be. So there's actually, to get some of the benefits on bone health, it looks like a slightly higher dose of creatine might be required. No study has actually compared low dose to high dose studies. But when we look at the literature that's out there, it looks like 6 to 10 grams per day is slightly more effective than 5 grams per day or less. So typically we clump the low dose studies as 3 to 5 grams a day, and the high dose studies anything more than 5 grams a day, so 6 to 10 grams. And it seems like, yeah, that 6 to 10 grams showed slightly more beneficial effects on bone health. And then from the brain perspective, we don't have any good dose response studies looking at the impacts of dose on brain. So we're currently running a study right now, and hopefully we can have some data to answer that question, but it actually might require a higher dose of creatine to get those brain benefits. So yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot more dose response studies need to be done with creatine. And then, the other question that you asked was like, would a bigger person actually need more creatine? And possibly. So in most of our studies, we actually use a relative dosing strategy. So similar to protein, where it's like grams per kilogram of body weight, we use a dosing strategy of 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram of body weight per day. And we know that that is a really effective strategy. And yeah, a bigger person might need a little bit more creatine just because they have more muscle. They're going to burn through a little bit more creatine per day. And so they might need a little bit more to replace those lost creatine stores. But unfortunately, we don't have really good data, dose response studies to really come to conclusive conclusions on a lot of these questions.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's often there's a lot of like in the air with that specifically. And like you said too, like with the loading doses and not. So I guess, I mean, would it be up to someone's preference then, depending on how fast they wanted the effects to creatine to work essentially?
Yeah, that's probably the kind of the simplest way to put it, especially at the muscle level. The bone and the brain, we just don't know. But at the muscle level, yeah, it basically comes down to how quick do you want those effects. If you want them in a week or 2 weeks, then you're going to have to consider loading. But if you just want it in 4 weeks or 8 weeks, yeah, you definitely don't need to load.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, this just popped in my head now as you were generally mentioning that. But if an individual, like, you know, in my case, I've been taking creatine now for like over years and like a long time. So let's say an individual were to just stop cold turkey right away. How long would it take for your creatine stores to essentially desaturate and you lose that saturation of whatever you gained?
About 4 to 6 weeks.
Wow. Okay. That's a long time. Yeah.
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 So I get this question as well. Like somebody will miss a day of creatine, like they've been supplementing with creatine for like 3 weeks and then they miss a day of creatine supplementation. They're like freaking out, like, oh, I'm going to lose all the gains from all this creatine.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, you're not. Like literally it's going to take 4 to 6 weeks for it to return back to baseline. And so that's why a lot of people might cycle on creatine, like cycle on and off creatine. That's another question that I commonly get as well. And there's no study to actually look at cycling on and off creatine versus taking creatine consistently.
Yeah.
We did recently published a meta-analysis where we combined all the studies where creatine was only provided on resistance training days. And we know that it enhanced muscle gains, muscle mass gains, and strength gains. And when creatine was only provided on resistance training days, so that it definitely works. But does it work to the same degree as taking it every day, or cycling on and off creatine? We just don't know the answers to those questions.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's a great way to put it. I mean, like, it's essentially a myth that you have to cycle on and off, because that myth is founded by, oh, you're going to have kidney issues and liver issues. I know in high school, people were saying, oh man, you're going to ruin your kidneys if you don't cycle off. But we know now, like, as you said, that that's simply a myth. And yeah, it's completely safe to take that long term. So 100%, that's a great way to put it, Dr. Forbes. Great. So I think,
Yeah, so another question that we had here for you was, what does the data look like as far as cognitive benefits for creatine? As you kind of alluded to before, there's some research about its effect on the brain and things like that. So I was just curious to know, because I was actually listening to another podcast where it was some MD that was talking about creatine. And what he had mentioned was that they actually saw an even more pronounced effect of this impact on the brain in like vegan and vegetarian populations, like AKA people not getting as much of it from their diet. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that at all, or what you can kind of talk about as far as cognitive benefits.
Yeah, definitely. So this is a really, I would say, an emerging area of research. There's definitely not as much research on this area than there is on the muscle performance benefits. But we know that you can supplement with creatine and get about a 5 to 10% increase in the amount of creatine within your brain. Whereas at the muscle level, it's about a 20% increase. And at the muscle level, it's really robust. So we know that like most people are going to see around that 20% increase. Whereas at the brain level, there's actually studies where they found no effect. Even some studies where they showed either phosphocreatine or creatine levels like slightly decrease following supplementation. So like the complete opposite of what you would think. But on the whole, it looks like about a 5 to 10% increase in the amount of creatine within your brain. And then, yeah, you mentioned vegans or vegetarians. So at the muscle level, we know because vegans or vegetarians don't consume red meat, seafood, and things that contain a decent amount of creatine from the diet, that they actually have lower amounts of creatine within their muscles. And so they're actually more responsive to creatine supplementation from a muscle performance standpoint. And there was one study looking at the impacts of vegetarians versus omnivores, those that eat meat at the brain level. And what they actually showed was that study was really interesting, actually, because what they showed was the meat eaters, they actually got worse over time. So the meat eater group got worse on their cognitive performance, and the vegetarians got slightly better. So post supplementation, they said that creatine supplementation was more responsive for vegetarians. But if you actually look at the data of that study, it's actually kind of confusing, because it made the creatine supplement made the meat eaters perform worse on the cognitive task. And the difference was really between the meat eaters and the vegetarians on the post-testing scores. So there was also a study that looked at brain creatine content between omnivores, those that eat meat, and those and vegans or vegetarians, and they actually found no difference in brain creatine levels. So I'm not too sure I would go as far as what that MD said and say that, you know, vegetarians respond better from a cognitive perspective than those that eat meat or omnivores. Based off that one individual study, that's a little bit hard to interpret, because the meat eaters got worse over time, which you wouldn't predict. And so I wouldn't go as far as that, but some of the other studies have definitely shown some benefits of creatine on brain health. We actually have a meta-analysis where we looked at all the studies that looked at memory following creatine supplementation. We combined them all together, and it shows a significant effect of taking creatine on memory. So we're trying to get that study published right now, because that's a pretty major finding, and an pretty important aspect of taking creatine. So there are some benefits of taking creatine from a cognitive perspective. And then I'm going to keep talking and mention a couple more points here, because creatine actually seems to be even better when your brain is stressed. And so there's a variety of different ways you can stress your brain. One is like mental fatigue. So maybe after this presentation, you might be like, oh, like I feel like I had an extra lecture today, and you have mental fatigue. Well, taking creatine in that situation could be a benefit. Or if you have tests coming up, things like that, and you feel really stressed out, there's evidence from a brain health perspective that creatine could be a benefit. Other ways, there's sleep deprivation. There's benefits of taking creatine, that we know that sleep deprivation impairs your cognition, but if you take creatine, it doesn't show that impairment, or it's really attenuated. There's also some benefits, at least in animal models, that if you have a traumatic brain injury or a concussion, that creatine can be effective and neuroprotective. So yeah, there's lots of kind of really interesting studies, particularly when the brain is stressed, showing some of the benefits of creatine on cognition.
Wow, I mean, that's a great answer. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So yeah, it's good to know though, because I was curious about after hearing that on that podcast. So it's interesting to hear that probably the study that Dr. I was listening to based on was like maybe not that great, or not that impressive, at least as far as any effect. So yeah, that's really good. I think that
Perfect.
I think Vinay, is that it for the questions that we had? Should we take questions from?
So yeah, that pretty much like sums up what we had prepared. But if anyone who's been listening has any like questions that I want to throw up, this is your time.
Yeah, please feel free to just put on your mic or text in the chat.
I guess we had one earlier. We kind of covered it though, pretty much. It was just, is there any downfalls to not going through the loading phase? And then we kind of discussed that was just that it takes a little bit longer, basically, for you to reach saturation. So
yeah. And while we're waiting for the questions to flow in, I just wanted to just like make a comment that as a student who constantly has like, like physical, like mental stress as well as physical stress, and like all those like, I feel like my memory just keeps declining with like more things I need to remember. So just like hearing that it will like help your brain kind of like memorize things better, but also like when it's under stress, which a lot of us are under, especially in times like now when we have like lots of finals coming up, I feel like that's like a very like valuable information for us to know.
Yeah, I've always thought of it from like a like occupational standpoint, like if like firefighters or something like that could really benefit from creatine supplementation because they're going to be stressed out. They're like have to wake up in the middle of the night all the time, so they're sleep deprived. You know, they have to make decisions really quickly, so they're going to have all that mental fatigue, and then they also have to do the physical performance. But yeah, students potentially could really benefit from creatine and perform better on exams. We should do a study on that. And
Yeah.
yeah, if
Yeah,
you can
that
show an improvement in, you know, cognitive performance for students, that'd be huge.
For sure. No, it's definitely
Yeah.
definitely something that could be used in the future. I know because like a lot of individuals too just think of it as just, you know, a muscle building supplement, but all this new research coming out shows its avenues for like use. So yeah, no, definitely that's something that could be useful in the future. So if there's anyone else, no questions for now. Oh, there's one more that popped up. Are there any supported downsides to take creatine besides the cost to buy it? I mean, other than in general. So yeah, so I mean, we mentioned this at the start, how now there's like this surge of, I mean, there's like a price surge now with creatine, unfortunately. But I mean, usually it used to be very like the most affordable supplement, I think for like 1,000 grams, like it would be like $20, whereas like a tub of protein is like $60 and that kind of thing. So I mean, it was probably the most affordable supplement that can give you the best amount of bang for your buck for a long time. But I mean, now there's been some issues with that, but I guess this leads into one question of, can you take it? Is it better to take in pill form or powdered form or like whatever cheaper kind of thing? Or is there a difference really?
Yeah, so most of the studies have been done on creatine monohydrate powder. And there's
Mm.
actually a recent review looking at alternative forms of creatine, like trying to enhance absorption and things like that. But at the end of the day, they concluded, and the evidence suggests that creatine monohydrate is the safest. So there's the most research on it. And we know that it's very safe. We know that it's effective, and it's actually the cheapest form of creatine as well. So I'm pretty cheap and I want to save money. So yeah, definitely buy just creatine monohydrate. But I think we also need to do more research looking at foods as well that contain creatine in it. And can you know, enhance athletic performance or just overall health by consuming more creatine in our diet? And there's actually a really interesting study in the US. They had 20,000 individuals, and they separated the data into quartiles. So those that consumed more creatine in their diet versus the ones that on the lowest quartile that didn't consume very much creatine in their diet. And what they found was the ones that didn't consume that much creatine in their diet, they actually had a higher risk of depression. So there's at least a relationship between those two variables. It wasn't a randomized controlled trial, so we don't know cause and effect, and there could be a lot of things that could be implicated with depression. And it's not my area of expertise, but it was an interesting relationship to show, and at least a link between creatine intake just through your diet. So not even taking a supplement or not, but just through your diet can influence, yeah, at least your brain health and at risk of depression.
I guess I think that the question that was asked was maybe alluding to like how should we say, like we've obviously talked a lot about like the benefits and stuff like that of creatine. Is there any person or population or anything like that that you think shouldn't take creatine, or where you think there might be yes, some negatives or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I always recommend if somebody has like kidney disease to talk to their physician, and I would be very cautious with taking creatine right now. But there's a study that's been approved in the Netherlands where they're actually going to be looking at the effects of creatine on individuals that are going through dialysis. So when you go through that process, you actually lose a lot of creatine. And again, we know all the benefits of creatine. So they're going to be giving these individuals that have kidney disease creatine. So we'll find out if it's safe for that population or not once that study's been published. But right now, I always suggest, if somebody has kidney disease, basically like go talk to your physician and maybe avoid creatine supplementation right now. The other one that's kind of interesting is like at what age should you start supplementing with creatine? So I get that all the time as well. And there is a recent review showing that it is safe for adolescents to take and it can enhance performance. There is scientific support for that. But I'm always cautious to recommend anyone under the age of 18 to take creatine. And there hasn't been a really good safety study showing, that creatine truly is safe for adolescents or children to take. There's no reason to think that it wouldn't be safe, but I'm always like to be cautious, particularly for those under the age of 18 as well. So that's my personal opinion on that. I don't recommend those younger than 18 take creatine. I always recommend that they get good sleep, eat lots of fruits and vegetables, and exercise regularly. If they do those three things, they're probably going to get better at whatever they're trying to be good at, just by following those. I call them the big hitters, like the sledgehammers. So that's always my recommendation, is just for younger individuals to focus on those big hitters: sleep, exercise, and just eating real food.
100%.
Awesome. There you have it, guys. That's the best answer you're going to get. So that's awesome.
Yeah, guys. So, I mean, we just want to thank you so much, Dr. Forbes, for all the information you brought here today. A lot of really interesting avenues that we didn't even consider regarding creatine. And I guess, regardless if you go to the gym or not, now there's enough information here today to maybe point you in a direction of maybe starting some creatine supplementation. And even if you are in the gym, hopefully you do start to take it at your own pace. I know me, Mark, and Sai have found a bunch of great effects on it. And I mean, I'll go as far to say I think it's the best natural supplement out there, if there's anything that's going to really give you a big, bang for your buck. So yeah, we just thank you so much. And if you have any more questions for us, you can just DM us on our Instagram page. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the session, unless Marcus, you guys have anything to add.
Oh, no, that was good. Thank you so much for coming out, Dr. Forbes. It was a great session. You enlightened us on all these creatine content. So definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you as well. It's really good. And obviously, thanks for taking the time to come out. So we just super, super lucky to get really awesome guests like this. So thanks again to Dr. Little for connecting you to us as well. So it's great.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a little nerve-wracking following Dr. Little, because he's a legendary, legit scientist. And I've been fortunate to collaborate with him on a few projects, including a creatine interval training study. And that particular study, we actually found no further benefit of creatine. So I don't know, maybe we mixed up or something like that in that particular study. But I think interval training, I don't know if that's what he's talked about or not, but interval training is really, really effective to enhance fitness. And creatine maybe has a small effect, but it was hard to tease out the effect of creatine when you combine it with interval training, because interval training was so potent, so effective, that creatine, probably just added a small effect that wasn't even measurable based off the sample size that we had. So I think that's another important thing, and thing that we talked about before this presentation started, was kind of the expectations with creatine. It's going to be beneficial. It's going to have beneficial effects to enhance muscle mass and muscle strength, particularly when you combine it with exercise. But it's not going to make you into Mr. Olympia in 2 weeks. So don't worry about that. I've been trying to get my biceps as much as possible and taking creatine, and it's helped a little bit, but it's, to put it into realistic expectations, it's a small benefit.
For sure.
Awesome.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and we appreciate it. And if you guys want to if you guys rolled in late, we have the whole thing recorded on the YouTube. We'll post it up on our Facebook page and Instagram. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a great